Finally, we have the Gospel of John, written around 90 to 100 of the Common Era, possibly in Ephesus or somewhere in Egypt. John is a radically different gospel in its chronology and content when compared to the Synoptics, that is, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In fact, 90% of John is exclusive to his account with no parallel to the Synoptics. However, the Gospel of John became the most influential book of the New Testament for proto-Orthodox theologians. It formed the backbone of their theology and Christology. Clement of Alexandria said that while the Synoptics speak of the ta somatica, the bodily things of Christ, John speaks of the ta pneumatica, the spiritual things of Christ. The Gospel of John is a profound meditation on Christ's theological significance. Instead of parables, the preferred pedagogical method of the Synoptic Jesus, the Johannine Jesus recites these very long monologues about his relationship and unity with the Father. At the very heart of these monologues are the famous ego emmi, or I am statements. These statements reveal Christ's exalted status as God, capital G, for Trinitarians, as the Messiah for Unitarians, or as a God, according to many historians. For example, John 10:30, the Father and I are one. John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Interestingly, this gospel was used extensively by the Gnostics due to its Platonist undertones, its duality, light, darkness, good, evil, spirit, flesh. Also, the pre-existence of the Logos mentioned in John chapter 1, John's famous prologue. In fact, the first ever commentary written on John was by Heracleon, a Gnostic teacher in the 2nd century. Some scholars believe that Corinthus wrote this gospel, another Gnostic teacher. However, many of these themes are also found in the writings of Middle Platonic Jewish philosopher Philo, as well as in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This means that 1st century Middle Eastern Jews were, to some significant degree, Hellenized. A character who is unique to John's gospel is the Paraclete. The Paraclete is a spirit of truth who will come after the departure of Christ to remind the believers about Christ and to guide the community. The Paraclete is referred to by Christians as the Spirit of Christ. It is explicitly called the Holy Spirit in John's Gospel, but according to Trinitarians, it is essentially equal with the Son. In 1 John chapter 2, Jesus is called the first Paraclete. Thus, the Johannine authors have mitigated the major crisis in the early Pauline Christian communities, the no-show immediate second coming of Jesus. John does not teach a future parousia. Christ came back as the Paraclete. This is called Johannine realized eschatology. By implication, the Paraclete also empowered the author to create a gospel that fully portrays Jesus' status. So the author of John seems to imply that his gospel is a divine revelation.
There are also some Gnostic ideas that are found in the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John has these sort of Gnostic ideas. In John chapter 6, verse 63, he says, the Spirit alone gives life, the flesh is of no avail. So this downplay of the flesh, this is very Gnostic in its idea, and it's all about the Spirit, that we are trapped in these mud bodies, and we have to escape this reality, because again, the world is this cosmic catastrophe, right? That's how Gnostics looked at the world. It was created by a lesser God, and that the true God comes as a Redeemer and blows on our sparks, as it were, which are our souls, and then through enlightened knowledge, we transcend our mud bodies. So this idea is also clearly presented in John chapter 3 with his doctrine of spiritual rebirth. John, the son of Zebedee, a disciple of Jesus, actually wrote this gospel, and then he also wrote 3 letters that are also in the New Testament, called the first epistle of John, the second epistle of John, and the third epistle of John. This was the traditional opinion that John, the son of Zebedee, he wrote the Gospel of John, and then 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which you'll find at the end of the New Testament, just before the book of Revelation. Clement goes on to say that John wrote a spiritual gospel. Now, some early scholars said that the author of the Gospel of John, and this is very interesting, they said that the author of the Gospel of John was a man named Corinthus, which is spelled C-E-R-I-N-T-H-U-S, Corinthus. And Corinthus was a Gnostic Christian. He was a Gnostic. What is a Gnostic Christian? Generally, a Gnostic Christian was an early Christian who did not believe that Isa alayhi salam had a physical body. So by today's standards, by today's Trinitarian standards, Gnosticism is seen as total blasphemy. They're seen as schismatics. But it's very interesting that many early scholars believe the Gospel of John to be from that school of thought, to be a Gnostic gospel. In other words, to be a totally blasphemous gospel, right? Or they say someone called John the Elder. right? John the Elder, a presbyter at the Church of Ephesus, wrote the Gospel around the year 100 of the Common Era. The bottom line, however, is that the Gospel is anonymous. No one knows who wrote this Gospel. The author of the Gospel of John never identifies himself. Traditionally, again, what happened, according to scholars, was you have the Johannine community. You have this community that authored the Gospel of John. Scholars believe that a significant segment of that community became Gnostic in their Christology. In other words, they said Jesus did not have a physical body. So they took the gospel with them and started their own community. So in response to that, the other half of the community, they made these additions to the Gospel of John to present more of the humanity of Jesus, but at the same time also present him as being God. That's why the prologue was added as well. So that's pretty much standard amongst New Testament scholars. So this successionist or separatist movement took the gospel with them and became full-blown Gnostics. Remember, it is a historical fact that the gospel was used by Gnostic circles. In fact, the first commentary on the Gospel of John, and this is a historical fact, the first commentary ever written on the Gospel of John was written by a man named Heracleon, Heracleon. Heracleon was a Valentinian Gnostic. He was a Gnostic. So it's very, very interesting that many scholars believe the Gospel of John was written by a Gnostic, Corinthus, and it is a historical fact that the first commentary ever written on the Gospel of John was written by a Gnostic named Heracleon. That tells us that originally the Gospel of John was a Gnostic gospel that would have been totally rejected by the vast, vast majority of Christians today, but it was eventually cleaned up by someone called the redactor, and Jesus was presented as human and divine, and eventually it was accepted as a canonical text. There are also some Gnostic ideas that are found in the Gospel of John. Remember, again, we had said, this is important, that's why we're repeating it, that many early scholars believed that the Gospel of John was initially written by a Gnostic named Corinthus. And of course, Gnosticism, by today's standards, is considered to be a Christian heresy. The Gnostics believed that Isa alayhi salam did not have a physical body, that he was simply a divine being who appeared as a phantasm to people who encountered him, that he would not even leave footprints on the sand, as they say, right? And it's a historical fact that the first commentary of the Gospel of John was actually written by a Gnostic, a Valentinian Gnostic named Heracleon.